The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, as Zara Findlay stared numbly at the lifeless body of her father. The year was 1874, and at 22, she suddenly found herself alone in a town that had never been particularly kind to her. Sheriff Thomas had always had it out for her father, accusing him of cheating at cards, stealing cattle, and any other crime that couldn't be pinned on someone else. This time, he'd made good on his threats. "Your pa resisted arrest," the sheriff muttered, holstering his gun with practiced ease. "Got what was coming to him." Zara knew better. Her father may have been many things: stubborn, proud, occasionally foolish, but he wasn't the criminal the town painted him to be. They'd survived by doing odd jobs, keeping to themselves, and dreaming of saving enough to buy a small plot of land outside town. Now those dreams lay bleeding into the dirt beside her father's body. "You have until sundown tomorrow to clear out of that shack," Sheriff Thomas said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Town's claiming it for taxes owed." Zara didn't cry. Not when they buried her father in the poor section of the cemetery. Not when she packed their meager belongings. Not even when she realized she had nowhere to go and less than $2 to her name. 3 days later, she sat at the same table where she and her father had shared their last meal. The tiny shack had been stripped of nearly everything she'd sold what little they had to pay for the burial, and by herself a few more days before starvation set in. The sheriff's men would be coming tomorrow to claim the property. She had tried to find work, but Silver Creek was a small town with a long memory, and no one would hire William Findlay's daughter. The empty wooden table before her seemed to mock her plight. No food for 3 days now. Her stomach had stopped growling and instead twisted with a dull, persistent ache. This table, where she'd shared thousands of meals with her father, would never again hold food for them to share. Something inside her finally broke. The tears came suddenly, violently, racking her thin frame as she buried her face in her hands. She wept for her father, for herself, for the future that had been stolen from them both. The door creaked open, startling her. Zara quickly wiped her eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. She expected Sheriff Thomas or one of his deputies come early to throw her out. Instead, a tall stranger filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the evening sun. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, dusty riding pants, and boots that had seen many miles. His dark brown hat was pulled low, obscuring part of his face, but she could see a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. "Madam," he said, his voice deep but gentle, "didn't mean to intrude." Zara straightened, painfully aware of her tear-stained face and disheveled appearance. "This is private property," she managed, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The stranger took a step inside, and she noticed the basket he carried. The smell wafting from it made her stomach clench painfully. "Name's Vaughn Keller," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick black hair and piercing blue eyes that studied her with unexpected kindness. "Just rode into town. Man at the livery mentioned you might be in need of some assistance." Old Sam at the livery was perhaps the only person in town who'd ever shown her father any kindness. "I don't need charity," Zara said, even as her eyes fixed hungrily on the basket. Vaughn crossed the room in 3 long strides and set the basket down on the empty table. "Share every meal with me," he said simply. The unexpected words hung in the air between them. Not an offer of charity, but of companionship. Zara looked up at him, confused by the gesture from a complete stranger. "Why would you do that?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Men didn't offer things without expecting something in return." "Because I've been where you are," he replied, unpacking the basket to reveal fried chicken, cornbread, and a jar of preserves. "And someone once did the same for me." The smell was overwhelming. Despite her pride, Zara felt her resolve weaken. "I'm leaving town tomorrow," she said, watching as he laid out 2 tin plates. "Where to?" he asked, placing a piece of chicken on each plate. "I don't know." The admission cost her, but it was the truth. Vaughn nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I'm heading to a place called Willow Bend, buying land there to raise horses. Need help getting established." Zara picked up a piece of chicken, trying to maintain her dignity by not devouring it instantly. "What does that have to do with me?" "I could use a partner," he said, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Someone who knows horses. Someone who isn't afraid of hard work." She narrowed her eyes. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't. But I've been watching you these past few days. Saw how you handled yourself at your father's funeral. Saw how you've been trying to find work. Saw how this town's been treating you. You've been watching me." The food suddenly tasted like ash in her mouth. "Not like that," he said quickly. "I'm looking for someone with grit. Someone who doesn't give up." He paused. "Your father was William Findlay?" Zara nodded warily. "He saved my life once," Vaughn said. "Years ago, when I was just a greenhorn trying to make my way west. Got caught in a blizzard up in the mountains. He found me, got me to shelter. Wouldn't take anything for it." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception. "My father never mentioned you." "He wouldn't have. It wasn't his way to talk about the good he did." Vaughn's eyes held hers. "I've been looking for him for years, to repay the debt. Found out he'd settled here, but I arrived too late." The story rang true. It sounded exactly like her father, generous to a fault, always willing to help strangers, never mentioning his good deeds. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. "A business arrangement. I have the money to buy the land, but I need someone who knows horses. Your father told me you have a way with them. And what do I get out of this arrangement?" "Equal partnership. After 2 years, half the profits, half the property." It sounded too good to be true. "Why would you offer that to a stranger?" "Because I owe your father my life," he said simply. "And because I need someone I can trust." Zara took another bite of chicken, considering her options, which were, in reality, non-existent. She could stay and face starvation or worse, or she could take a chance on the stranger with kind eyes who claimed to have known her father. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Vaughn nodded, respecting her caution. "Train leaves at noon tomorrow. I'll have a ticket waiting for you if you decide to come." They finished the meal in silence, and when he left, he purposely forgot the remaining food in the basket. Zara didn't sleep that night. She paced the small shack, weighing her decision. By dawn, she'd made up her mind. What choice did she really have? The next morning, she packed her few remaining possessions and walked to the train station. Vaughn was waiting on the platform, a genuine smile lighting his face when he saw her. He didn't say, "I knew you'd come," or anything presumptuous. He simply tipped his hat and said, "Morning, Miss Findlay." As the train pulled away from Silver Creek, Zara watched the town shrink into the distance. She had no idea what awaited her in Willow Bend, but for the first time in years, she felt something close to hope. The journey to Willow Bend took 3 days by train and another by stagecoach. During that time, Zara learned that Vaughn Keller was a man of few words but considerable substance. He'd spent years working cattle drives and breaking horses before saving enough to buy his own spread. He didn't drink to excess, didn't gamble, and treated her with a respect she found both surprising and refreshing. Willow Bend turned out to be little more than a cluster of buildings serving the surrounding ranches, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a livery stable. But the land Vaughn had purchased was even more beautiful than he'd described. 300 acres of rolling grassland bordered by a clear stream and dotted with stands of aspen and pine. The cabin was small but solid, with 2 rooms and a lean-to that would serve as a kitchen. It needs work, Vaughn admitted as they stood surveying the property on their first evening. But the bones are good. It's perfect, Zara said softly, watching as the setting sun painted the distant mountains gold and pink. They settled into a routine. Vaughn worked on repairing the cabin and building corrals, while Zara planted a garden and began making connections with local ranchers who might be interested in their horses. They took their meals together as promised, sometimes talking about their plans for the ranch, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. True to his word, Vaughn treated her as a business partner, respecting her opinions and deferring to her judgment when it came to horses. When they attended the local livestock auction, he insisted on introducing her as his partner, not his hired help. 3 months after their arrival, they purchased their first breeding stock, 2 fine mares and a stallion with a bloodline that promised speed and endurance. Zara spent hours with the animals, gentling them, earning their trust. Vaughn would sometimes pause in his work to watch her, a look of admiration on his face that made her flush with pleasure. Their first winter in Willow Bend tested them. Snow piled high around the cabin, and temperatures dropped so low that they had to bring the newborn foals inside to keep them from freezing. They took turns staying up through the night, tending the animals and keeping the fire going. One particularly brutal night, as they huddled near the stove drinking coffee, Vaughn suddenly asked, "Why didn't you ever marry?" The question caught Zara off guard. "No one ever asked," she said simply. "And even if they had, my father needed me." Vaughn nodded, understanding loyalty to family. "What about now?" She looked at him, uncertain of his meaning. "Now? Would you consider it now? Marriage, I mean." Zara's heart stuttered. "Are you asking?" He looked into his coffee cup as if the answer might be found there. "Not exactly. Just wondering if it's something you want for your future." "I haven't thought much about it," she admitted. "There's been too much else to consider." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but something had changed between them. A possibility had been acknowledged, even if neither was ready to pursue it. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. Their first foals were born strong, healthy animals that promised to bring good prices. Word began to spread about the quality of their stock, and ranchers started making the journey to see for themselves. One such visitor was Theodore Maxwell, the wealthiest rancher in the territory. He arrived with his son James, a handsome young man with an easy smile and expensive clothes. "Heard you have some promising stock," Maxwell said, dismounting from his magnificent bay stallion. "We believe so," Vaughn replied, shaking the man's hand firmly. James Maxwell's eyes, however, weren't on the horses. They were fixed on Zara, who was leading one of the yearlings through its paces in the corral. "Didn't expect to find a lady running a horse operation," he said, approaching the fence. "James Maxwell at your service." Zara acknowledged him with a nod but continued working with the horse. "That's quite a technique you have there," James persisted. "Where did you learn it?" "My father," she replied, not breaking her concentration. James leaned against the fence rail. "I'd be interested in learning more. Perhaps over dinner? I could ride back tomorrow." Before Zara could respond, Vaughn was beside them. "We're pretty busy with the spring foaling," he said, his voice neutral but his eyes hard. "Not much time for socializing." James glanced between them, a knowing smile forming. "I see. Well, the invitation stands, Miss Findlay. Anytime." The Maxwells did purchase 2 of their yearlings, paying a fair price without haggling. As they rode away, Zara turned to Vaughn. "You didn't have to intervene," she said. "I can handle men like James Maxwell." "I know you can," Vaughn replied, his jaw tight. "I just didn't like the way he was looking at you." "And how was that?" "Like you were another fine piece of horseflesh he wanted to acquire." Zara couldn't help but smile. Are you jealous, Mr. Keller? Vaughn looked startled, then embarrassed. Maybe I am, he admitted. Would that bother you? The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. No, she said softly. It wouldn't bother me at all. That evening, as they shared their meal at the table Vaughn had built with his own hands, something subtle shifted in their relationship. Their glances lingered longer, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed dishes back and forth. When Vaughn walked her to the door of her small room, he paused. Zara, he said, his voice low, I need to say something. She looked up at him, heart racing. Yes, I didn't bring you here just because of a debt to your father. His eyes held hers, serious and intent. From the moment I saw you, even in your grief, I knew you were someone special. Someone I wanted in my life. Zara felt a flush creep up her neck. Why didn't you say anything before? Because I wanted you to see me as a partner first. To know you could trust me. He took a deep breath. And because I was afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of your situation. She reached out hesitantly, placing her hand on his arm. I never thought that. Vaughn covered her hand with his own. I'm not good with words, Zara, but I care for you, more than I've ever cared for anyone. I care for you too, she whispered. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her. It was gentle, questioning, and over almost before it began. But it left Zara breathless. Good night, he said, stepping back reluctantly. Good night, she replied, a smile spreading across her face. The following weeks were filled with stolen moments between their work, brief touches, tender glances, conversations that stretched into the night. Vaughn courted her properly, bringing wildflowers he'd picked on his rides around the property, reading aloud from books he'd ordered from Denver, listening attentively to her stories about her father and her childhood. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he said, Do you remember the first day we met? Zara nodded. I was at my lowest point. You were crying over an empty table, he said, and all I could think to do was offer to share my meals with you. It was exactly what I needed, she said. Not just the food, but the companionship. The promise that I wouldn't be alone anymore. Vaughn took her hand. I'd like to share every meal with you for the rest of our lives, Zara Findlay. She looked at him, understanding dawning. Vaughn Keller, are you proposing to me? He smiled, suddenly nervous. I am. I know it hasn't been that long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Zara felt tears well in her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed that day in Silver Creek. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss deeper and more passionate than before, full of promise and longing. Their wedding was a simple affair, held under the aspen trees on their property with only a few neighbors and the circuit preacher in attendance. Zara wore a blue dress she'd ordered from the catalog, and Vaughn wore a new shirt and his freshly polished boots. Their vows were brief but heartfelt, pledging to stand by each other through whatever life might bring. That night, as Vaughn carried her across the threshold of their cabin, now expanded to include a proper bedroom, Zara felt a happiness she'd never thought possible after her father's death. Welcome home, Mrs. Keller, Vaughn said, setting her gently on her feet. I've been home since the day you walked into that shack in Silver Creek, she replied, reaching up to touch his face. You saved me, Vaughn. He shook his head. No, you saved yourself. I just offered a hand up. Their life together wasn't without challenges. The following year brought drought that dried up their stream and withered the grass. They had to sell some of their stock to buy feed for the remaining animals. Then came an early winter that nearly buried their cabin in snow and killed 2 of their best maras. Through it all, they faced each difficulty together, drawing strength from each other and their shared dream. Vaughn never once suggested that Zara should take a less active role in the ranch operations, even when neighbors raised eyebrows at seeing her breaking horses or negotiating sales. He stood proudly at her side, introducing her as my wife and partner to everyone they met. 3 years after they'd arrived in Willow Bend, their hard work began to pay off. Their breeding program had produced horses that were becoming known throughout the territory for their intelligence, endurance, and even tempers. They hired 2 hands to help with the expanded operation and built a proper barn and additional corrals. On the 5th anniversary of the day they'd met, Vaughn surprised Zara with a special dinner. He'd sent the hands into town, ensuring they'd have the ranch to themselves, and spent the day preparing her favorite foods. "What's the occasion?" she asked, admiring the table set with their good dishes and adorned with wildflowers. 5 years ago today, I set a basket on your table and asked you to share every meal with me," he said, pulling out her chair. Zara felt her eyes fill with tears. "You remember the exact day?" "I remember everything about that day," he said seriously. "The way the light hit your face when I opened that door. The courage I saw in your eyes, even through your tears. The way my heart seemed to stop when you looked up at me. I thought you were the strangest man I'd ever met," she admitted with a laugh. "Offering food to a stranger and then proposing a business partnership in the same breath. I knew what I wanted from the moment I saw you," he said, taking her hand across the table. "Even if it took me a while to admit it to myself." Their meal was interrupted by a knock at the door. Vaughn frowned, clearly annoyed at the intrusion on their special evening. When he opened the door, Sheriff Miller from town stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Evening, Vaughn. Sorry to disturb you, but I've got some news you need to hear." Zara joined them at the door, concern etched on her face. "It's about Thomas, the sheriff from Silver Creek," Miller said. "He's dead." Zara felt a cold shock run through her. "How?" "Shot in a saloon brawl. But before he died, he made a confession." Miller shifted uncomfortably. "About your father, madam. Seems he admitted to shooting him without cause and then claiming self-defense." The news hit Zara like a physical blow. All these years, she'd known her father was innocent, but to have it confirmed and to know that Thomas had lived 5 years with that lie left her reeling. "There's more," Miller continued. "Thomas had seized your father's property illegally. There's compensation coming. Not much, but the town council of Silver Creek wants to make amends." After the sheriff left, Zara stood motionless in the center of the room, tears streaming down her face. Vaughn wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against his chest. "He was innocent," she whispered. "He was innocent, and I always knew it, but no one would believe me." "I believed you," Vaughn said softly, "from the first moment you told me about him." She looked up at her husband, seeing the love and understanding in his eyes. "Do you think he would be proud of what we've built here?" "I know he would," Vaughn said. "Just as I know he'd be proud of the woman you've become." They finished their anniversary dinner sitting side by side on the porch, watching the stars come out over their land. Vaughn kept his arm around her shoulders, occasionally pressing a kiss to her temple. "I have something to tell you," Zara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I've suspected for a few weeks now." Vaughn turned to look at her, curiosity in his eyes. "I'm going to have a baby," she said, a smile spreading across her face despite the emotional turmoil of the evening. For a moment, Vaughn seemed unable to speak. Then he let out a whoop of joy that must have been heard clear into town. He lifted her from her seat and spun her around, then immediately set her down again, suddenly concerned. "I'm sorry, should I not have done that? I don't want to hurt you or the baby." Zara laughed, the sound bright and clear in the night air. "I'm not made of glass, Vaughn Keller. You won't break me." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said in wonder. "Our baby." "If it's a boy," she said, covering his hand with her own, "I'd like to name him William after my father. And if it's a girl?" "Hope," Zara said without hesitation. "Because that's what you gave me when you set that basket on my table 5 years ago." The baby, born the following spring, was indeed a boy, William Vaughn Keller, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Hope, and 3 years after that by another son, James. The Keller ranch prospered over the years, expanding to include cattle as well as horses. They built a new, larger house as their family grew, but they kept the original cabin standing as a reminder of where they'd started. Every evening, no matter how busy they were, Vaughn and Zara made a point of sitting down together for dinner. Sometimes their table was surrounded by children, ranch hands, and neighbors. Sometimes it was just the two of them. But always, they shared the meal together, just as Vaughn had promised on that fateful day in Silver Creek. On their 20th anniversary, after the children were grown and the youngest had left for college back east, Vaughn surprised Zara with a picnic basket much like the one he'd brought to her that first day. "Share every meal with me," he said. His hair now streaked with silver, but his eyes still as blue and keen as ever. "Always," Zara replied, taking his hand across the table that had seen so many of their life's moments. "Always and forever." As the sun set over the land they'd built together, Zara reflected on how far she'd come from that empty table where she'd once wept alone. Every hardship, every joy, every triumph and setback had been better because they'd faced it together. Their love story might have begun with grief and an empty table, but it had grown into something richer and more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined. And it had all started with a simple invitation to share a meal.